The candle on the writing desk had burned down to almost nothing, and still Evelyn Hastings sat awake, staring at the letter she had written 3 times and torn up twice. Downstairs she could hear laughter, glasses clinking, and the low hum of conversation drifting from the grand hall where her husband was entertaining guests she had never even been introduced to. She had stopped counting the nights he came home after she was already asleep. She had stopped counting the times he looked past her at dinner as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to speak. Tonight, though, something inside her had finally cracked open. It had happened in front of everyone. The Earl of Brynmore's wife had asked Evelyn a simple question about the upcoming charity gathering, and before she could answer, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Callenridge, had cut across her words entirely, redirecting the conversation toward a trade agreement he wanted to discuss with the Earl himself. He hadn't even glanced at her. It was as if she had not spoken at all. She remembered standing there, holding her wine glass a little too tightly, watching the room continue as though nothing strange had happened. But something had happened. Something that had been building for 3 years finally reached its edge. Evelyn folded the letter she had finally managed to write, and placed it on the pillow where he would find it, though she doubted he would even notice it was missing when he came looking for her. If he came looking for her at all. She packed only what she needed: a single trunk of clothes, a locket that had belonged to her mother, and the small amount of money she had saved quietly over the years without him knowing. By the time the sun rose over the hills surrounding Callenridge, she was already 3 hours down the road in a hired carriage, watching the towers of the estate shrink behind her until they disappeared completely. She did not cry. She had expected to, but instead she felt something closer to relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. The carriage driver, an older man named Edmund Price, glanced back at her more than once during the journey, clearly curious about a woman traveling alone with barely any luggage, and an expression that was somewhere between grief and freedom. He did not ask questions, and she was grateful for that. "Where would you like me to take you, ma'am?" he finally asked as they reached a crossroads. Evelyn hesitated. She had not planned this far ahead. She had only known that she needed to leave, that staying another day in that house would mean losing something in herself she could not afford to lose. "Somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere no one will recognize me." Edmund nodded slowly, as though he understood more than he let on, and turned the carriage toward the smaller villages that dotted the countryside beyond the city, places untouched by the noise and politics of noble houses. Meanwhile, back at Callenridge, Julian woke late in the afternoon with a headache from the previous night's wine, and the vague memory of a conversation about trade tariffs that had gone rather well. It took him almost an hour to realize the house felt different, quieter, wrong. He found the letter on her pillow and read it twice before the words actually settled into his mind. "I cannot keep pretending we have a marriage when you have made it clear, in every way that matters, that you do not see me at all. I am not writing this out of anger, though I have plenty of reason for it. I am writing this because I finally understand that staying will cost me more than leaving ever could." He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at nothing. He was a man used to controlling every situation, every negotiation, every room he walked into. But this was not something he could argue his way through or charm his way out of. Evelyn was gone, and for the first time in longer than he could admit, the house felt unbearably empty. His steward, a careful and quiet man named Oliver Fenwick, knocked softly before entering. "Your Grace, the staff mentioned that Lady Callenridge left early this morning. Should I send word to the stables?" Julian did not answer right away. He was still holding the letter, his knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. "No," he finally said, "not yet." He told himself she would come back within the week. She always did, after their small disagreements, the cold silences that followed dinner parties, where he had been too absorbed in politics to notice her. But something told him, deep in the part of his mind he rarely allowed himself to listen to, that this time was different. Days passed, and there was no word from her, no letter, no message through any of the usual channels. Julian threw himself into his usual routine: meetings with merchants, discussions about expanding trade routes, correspondence with other noble houses. But he found himself distracted in ways he had never experienced before. He would catch himself listening for her footsteps in the hallway, only to remember she was not there. At a dinner meant to discuss a potential alliance with a wealthy merchant family, Julian found himself staring at the empty seat beside him, the one Evelyn used to occupy. The merchant's daughter, a pleasant young woman named Charlotte, tried to make conversation with him twice before giving up entirely, exchanging a look with her father that suggested the Duke of Callenridge was not quite himself. Word began to spread through the social circles of the city, quiet whispers at first. The Duchess had not been seen in weeks. Some said she had traveled to visit family, Others, more perceptive, noticed the way Julian's temper had shortened, the way his estate seemed to be running with less order than before. Evelyn, meanwhile, had settled into a small village called Ashford Hollow, nestled between rolling hills and a slow-moving river. She had rented a modest cottage from a kind widow named Margaret Whitlock, who asked no questions about her past and seemed content simply to have company in her later years. The village was nothing like Callenridge. There were no grand halls, no glittering chandeliers, no whispered political conversations over expensive wine. Instead, there was a small schoolhouse in need of a teacher, a market square that came alive every morning with vendors selling bread and vegetables, and neighbors who greeted each other by name without any thought of rank or title. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she could breathe. She took the position at the schoolhouse within her first week in the village, teaching a group of children who were curious, energetic, and utterly unconcerned with who she used to be. They only cared that she was patient, that she made lessons interesting, and that she never raised her voice even when they misbehaved. In the evenings, she would sit with Margaret by the fire, sharing simple meals and quiet conversation. Margaret had lost her husband many years ago and often spoke about the strange freedom that comes after loss, the way life rebuilds itself into something unexpected. "You have the look of someone who left something behind," Margaret said one evening, not unkindly, simply observing. Evelyn considered lying, but found she did not have the energy for it. "I did," she admitted, "a life that was not really mine anymore." Margaret nodded slowly, as though she had heard versions of this story before. Sometimes leaving is the only way to find out who you really are. Evelyn thought about those words often in the weeks that followed. She began to notice small things about herself that she had forgotten, the way she used to hum while cooking, the way she genuinely enjoyed helping others learn, the quiet confidence that came from making her own decisions without needing anyone's approval. Back in Callenridge, Julian's patience with uncertainty was wearing thin. He had sent quiet inquiries through trusted contacts, asking if anyone had seen a woman matching Evelyn's description traveling through the countryside. Each inquiry came back empty. One evening, sitting alone in his study with a glass of wine he had barely touched, Julian allowed himself to think honestly about the last 3 years for the first time. He remembered the early days of their marriage, when he had genuinely admired her intelligence, her quiet strength, the way she handled difficult social situations with more grace than he ever managed. He remembered thinking, in those early months, that he had found someone who understood him in ways no one else did. Somewhere along the way, he had let the demands of his title consume every part of his attention. He had told himself it was necessary, that maintaining the estate and its influence required constant vigilance. But sitting there now, in the silence of a house that had once felt full simply because she was in it, he understood a harder truth. He had not lost her because he was too busy. He had lost her because he had chosen, again and again, to treat her as though she did not matter as much as everything else in his life. And now that she was gone, he was beginning to realize that nothing else mattered nearly as much as he had convinced himself it did. He set down the wine glass, still full, and made a decision that would take him weeks to fully act upon, but one that had already begun taking root in his mind. He needed to find her, not to bring her back to the life she had left, but to understand what he had done, and perhaps, if there was any chance left, to become someone worth forgiving. Outside his window, the night was quiet, the stars scattered across a clear sky. Somewhere beyond the hills, in a village he did not yet know existed, Evelyn Hastings was learning to live a life entirely her own, unaware that the man she had left behind was finally beginning to understand what he had thrown away. The following morning, Julian summoned Oliver Fenwick to his study earlier than usual. The steward arrived to find the Duke already dressed, papers spread across his desk, though none of them appeared to be the trade documents he usually reviewed. "I need you to be discreet about something," Julian said, his voice quieter than Oliver was used to hearing. "Of course, Your Grace. I want you to find someone who can search for the Duchess, not through the usual social channels, someone who understands how to look for a person who does not wish to be found." Oliver studied his employer for a moment, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the untouched breakfast tray on the side table. In all his years serving the Callenridge household, he had never seen the Duke look quite so unsettled. "I know of a man in the city," Oliver said carefully. "He has helped other households with delicate matters before. I can send word to him today." Julian nodded, then hesitated. "Oliver, before you go, tell me something honestly. Did the staff know about how things were between us?" The steward chose his words with care. "The staff noticed many things, Your Grace. It was not my place to speak of them." The answer landed harder than Julian expected. If the servants had seen the distance between him and his wife so clearly, How had he managed to convince himself for so long that everything was simply a matter of time and pressure, that Evelyn understood the demands placed upon him? He spent the rest of the morning reviewing correspondence he normally would have delegated entirely, if only to keep his hands occupied and his mind from spiraling further into regret. But even as he signed letters and approved expenditures, his thoughts kept drifting back to a conversation he and Evelyn had shared years earlier, in the first months of their marriage, when she had asked him what kind of husband he intended to be. He remembered laughing at the question then, brushing it aside as unnecessary, certain that his actions would speak for themselves. Now, sitting alone in a house that felt colder every day, he understood that his actions had indeed spoken, just not in the way he had intended. By evening, Oliver returned with news that a discreet investigator named Henry Boswell had agreed to take on the search, though he warned Julian that finding someone who genuinely did not want to be located could take considerable time. Julian accepted the delay with a grim nod, though patience had never been one of his strengths. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself waiting on something he could not control through wealth, title, or influence alone. All he could do now was wait, and hope that when Evelyn was finally found, there would still be some part of her willing to hear what he needed to say. The schoolhouse bell rang out across Ashford Hollow just as a sudden summer storm broke over the village, sending children scattering with laughter toward their homes, while Evelyn hurried to close the shutters before the rain could ruin the books stacked near the window. She had been in the village for nearly 2 months now, and the rhythm of this new life had settled into her bones in a way she had not expected. Mornings began with the walk to the schoolhouse, greeting neighbors along the way who called her by the name she had chosen for this new chapter, Evelyn Marsh, a small change that felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. The children she taught ranged from 6 to 12 years old, a mix of farmers' sons and daughters, the blacksmith's twins, and a quiet boy named Peter whose mother had recently passed and whose father, a carpenter named Gareth, struggled to raise him alone. Evelyn found herself drawn to Peter especially, recognizing something of her own grief reflected in his careful silence. "You have a gift with them," Margaret told her one evening as they shared tea by the fire, rain still tapping gently against the windows from the storm earlier that day. "The last teacher this village had could barely keep the children in their seats. You have them reciting poetry." Evelyn smiled, though it was a tired smile. Teaching filled most of her days with purpose, but the nights still carried moments where old memories crept back in, uninvited. She would catch herself thinking about the early years of her marriage, before everything had grown cold, wondering if she had done enough to save what once seemed like genuine affection. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Margaret asked gently, sensing the shift in her mood. "No," Evelyn said, and she meant it. "I regret staying as long as I did." Margaret nodded, understanding more than most could about the particular grief of leaving a life behind, even one that had caused pain. She had lost her husband to illness many years before, and though the circumstances were different, she recognized the same slow process of rebuilding a life from pieces that no longer fit together the way they once had. As the weeks passed, Evelyn began forming genuine friendships in the village beyond Margaret. There was Grace Fairweather, the baker's wife, who always saved the freshest bread for her and insisted on hearing stories about the children's antics at school. There was also a young widow named Alice Thornberry, who ran the small apothecary shop and had a sharp wit that made Evelyn laugh more than she had in years. One afternoon, while helping Grace organize the small charity fund the village used to support families in need, Evelyn overheard 2 women discussing news that had apparently traveled from the city. "They say the Duke of Callenridge has become quite unbearable to work for," one woman said, not realizing Evelyn was within earshot. "My cousin's husband delivers grain to the estate, and he says the staff are leaving faster than they can be replaced. The Duke barely eats, snaps at anyone who speaks to him, and the house looks nothing like it used to." Evelyn felt her chest tighten at the mention of Callenridge, though she kept her expression neutral, continuing to sort through the donated clothing in front of her. "Some say his wife left him," the other woman added, "though no one seems to know where she went. Quite the scandal, though the family has managed to keep most of it quiet." Evelyn excused herself shortly after, walking home slower than usual, her mind churning with unexpected feelings. She had not thought Julian capable of falling apart without her presence to manage the household, to smooth over his sharper edges in public. Part of her felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction, though she quickly recognized how hollow that feeling was. Another part of her, one she resented more, felt a small pang of concern she had not expected to still carry for him. That evening, she confided in Margaret about what she had overheard. "It is strange," Evelyn admitted, staring into the fire. "I thought leaving would feel like closing a door completely, but hearing his name still makes something twist inside me. That is not so strange, Margaret said. You spent years building a life with that man, even if it was not the life you deserved. Feelings do not disappear simply because we will them to. I do not want to feel anything for him anymore. Wanting and feeling are rarely the same thing, Margaret replied. Give yourself time. You left because you needed to survive. Healing comes slower than survival does. Evelyn appreciated Margaret's wisdom, though it did little to settle the unease that lingered in the following days. She threw herself further into her work at the schoolhouse, organizing a small performance where the children would recite poems and short plays for the village, a project that consumed most of her free time and thoughts. Peter, the quiet boy who had lost his mother, surprised everyone by volunteering to recite a poem about resilience, one Evelyn had taught the class the previous week. She spent extra time with him after lessons, helping him practice, and in doing so found herself forming a bond with the boy that felt unexpectedly healing for them both. Do you think my mother would be proud? Peter asked one afternoon, after a particularly good rehearsal. Evelyn knelt down to his level, keeping her voice gentle. I think she would be more proud than you could imagine. You have worked so hard, Peter, and that hard work shows. The boy's small smile in response reminded Evelyn of exactly why she had chosen teaching, why the schoolhouse had become more than just a place of employment but a genuine source of purpose in her new life. Meanwhile, word continued to trickle into the village about the state of Callenridge, each piece of gossip painting a picture of a household in decline. Evelyn tried to distance herself from these conversations, though curiosity occasionally got the better of her, especially when Grace mentioned overhearing that the Duke had hired someone to search for his missing wife. Do you think he will find her? Grace asked one afternoon, unaware of the true weight her question carried. I could not say, Evelyn replied carefully, focusing her attention on the ledger they were reviewing together. People who wish to disappear often manage to stay hidden, if they are careful enough. Grace laughed lightly, moving on to discuss other village matters, and Evelyn allowed herself a small breath of relief that her secret remained safely intact. But as autumn approached and the leaves along the village roads began to turn, Evelyn found herself thinking more frequently about the investigator apparently searching for her. She had chosen her new identity carefully, avoided any correspondence that could trace back to her true origins, and trusted that a small village far removed from the usual noble circles would be the last place anyone thought to search. Still, a small worry nested itself in the back of her mind, one she tried to push away each time it surfaced. What would she do if he actually found her? What would she say to a man who had once made her feel invisible in her own home? She raised this worry with Margaret one quiet evening, admitting the fear she had been carrying. If he finds you, Margaret said slowly, choosing her words with care, you are not obligated to return to him. You left for good reasons. Whatever he says or does now does not erase those reasons. I know, Evelyn said, but I worry that seeing him again might undo the progress I have made here. I have finally built something that feels like mine. Then you protect it, Margaret said firmly. You listen if he has something to say, but you do not have to give up what you have built simply because he decides, months too late, that he wants you back. Evelyn held on to those words in the weeks that followed, trying to focus on the life she had built rather than the uncertainty of what might come. The village's small performance day arrived, and Peter delivered his poem beautifully, earning applause from the entire community, and a proud smile from his father, that had been rare since his wife's passing. Watching the children's performance, surrounded by the warmth of a community that had welcomed her without question, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of genuine happiness, one untangled from the complicated feelings that thoughts of Callenridge still stirred within her. She did not know, as she stood there applauding alongside Margaret and Grace, that a discreet investigator named Henry Boswell had already begun narrowing his search toward the very region surrounding Ashford Hollow, following a trail of small clues that had slowly, patiently led him closer to the village she had chosen as her refuge. The storm that had passed through earlier in the season had cleared the roads for easier travel, and within weeks, Henry Boswell would find himself standing at the edge of Ashford Hollow, quietly asking questions about a schoolteacher who had arrived a few months prior, a woman who matched the description he had been given in careful, exacting detail. For now, though, Evelyn remained unaware, continuing to build her new life one day at a time, unaware that the quiet peace she had found was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. A few days after the performance, the village held its harvest gathering, an annual tradition where families brought food to share, children played games in the square, and musicians filled the evening air with simple, cheerful tunes. Evelyn had never attended anything like it during her years at Callenridge, where every gathering was carefully arranged for political advantage rather than genuine celebration. She stood near a long table laden with bread, cheese, and preserved fruits, watching Peter chase after the blacksmith's twins with a wooden sword one of the older boys had carved for him. Gareth, the boy's father, approached her with 2 cups of warm cider. "He has not laughed like that in a long while," Gareth said, handing her a cup. "Whatever you have done for him at that schoolhouse, I am grateful for it." "He is a remarkable boy," Evelyn replied honestly. "He simply needed someone to remind him that it was safe to be a child again, even after such a loss." Gareth nodded, his eyes drifting toward his son with an expression of quiet relief. "Losing his mother nearly broke something in him. I did not know how to fix it. I am not sure I could have, without your help." Evelyn felt a warmth in her chest at his words, a reminder of exactly why she had thrown herself so completely into her new role. Here, in this small village, she was not simply a duchess expected to smile politely and manage social obligations. She was someone who made a genuine difference in people's lives, someone whose presence mattered for reasons entirely separate from status or title. As the evening wore on, Margaret found her sitting on a low wooden bench near the edge of the square, watching the festivities with a thoughtful expression. "You look far away," Margaret said, settling beside her. "I was thinking about how different this feels," Evelyn admitted. Everything at Callenridge was so calculated. Every smile, every conversation, all of it served some larger purpose. Here, people simply enjoy each other's company. "That is the difference between a life built on obligation and one built on genuine connection," Margaret said. "You are learning to live the second kind now." Evelyn considered this as she watched Grace and her husband dance clumsily near the musicians, laughing at their own missteps without any concern for appearances. It struck her how foreign such carefree joy would have seemed only months earlier, when every public appearance required careful composure and constant awareness of how she might be perceived. Later that night, after the gathering had wound down and most of the village had returned to their homes, Evelyn walked back toward her cottage under a sky full of stars, feeling more settled in herself than she had in years. She thought of Julian only briefly, a fleeting memory of how different their life together had been from the simple warmth she had witnessed that evening, before pushing the thought aside and focusing instead on the life she was actively choosing to build. The following week brought a change in the weather. Cooler mornings and the first hints of autumn color spreading across the hills surrounding the village. Evelyn adjusted her lessons accordingly, incorporating seasonal themes into her teaching, having the children collect leaves for a project on nature and change. During one such lesson, as the children pressed leaves between pages of old books to preserve them, young Peter asked a question that caught Evelyn off guard. "Do leaves feel sad when they fall, Miss Marsh?" Evelyn considered the question carefully, recognizing the deeper layers beneath a child's simple curiosity. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes things need to let go of what they were, so that something new can grow in the spring. It might look like sadness, but it is really just change making room for something better." Peter nodded thoughtfully, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and returned to his leaf collection with renewed focus. Evelyn watched him for a moment longer, recognizing that the words she had offered him applied just as much to her own life as they did to his innocent question about the changing seasons. That evening, as she prepared her lessons for the following day, Grace arrived at her door with a concerned expression, a rare occurrence given her usually cheerful disposition. "There is a stranger asking questions in the village," Grace said without preamble. "A man well-dressed, asking the shopkeepers if they know of any new arrivals in recent months, particularly a woman traveling alone." Evelyn felt her stomach drop, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Did anyone give him information?" "Not that I am aware of," Grace said. "Most people here are protective of newcomers, especially those who have clearly come seeking a quieter life. But I thought you should know, given that you arrived not too long ago yourself." Evelyn thanked Grace for the warning, closing the door once her friend had left, and leaning against it for a long moment, her heart pounding. She had known this day might come eventually, but knowing it in theory and facing the reality of it were entirely different experiences. She spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of her small cottage, turning over every possible outcome in her mind. Perhaps the stranger was searching for someone else entirely, some other woman with a similarly private past. Or perhaps, as she feared most, Henry Boswell had finally traced her steps to Ashford Hollow, bringing with him the possibility that her carefully rebuilt life was about to collide with the one she had left behind. Evelyn barely slept that night, and by morning she had made a decision. She would not hide from whatever was coming. If Henry Boswell, or whoever this stranger was, had truly traced her to Ashford Hollow, she needed to know the truth rather than living in constant fear of discovery. She walked to the schoolhouse as usual, though her mind remained distracted throughout the morning lessons. The children noticed her uncharacteristic quietness, and even young Peter asked if something was wrong, to which she offered only a reassuring smile and a gentle deflection. During the midday break, Grace arrived at the schoolhouse with news that confirmed Evelyn's worst suspicions. "The stranger has been asking more specific questions," Grace said quietly, pulling Evelyn aside from the children playing in the yard. "He described a woman with dark hair, gray eyes, and a manner of speaking that suggested education, beyond what most of our village women receive. He mentioned she might be going by a different name." Evelyn's throat tightened. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was searching for her specifically, and the description was far too accurate to be coincidence. "Did he give a name?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Henry Boswell," Grace confirmed. "He is staying at the inn near the village entrance. He has been quite polite about his inquiries, not aggressive, simply persistent." Evelyn thanked Grace for the information, then spent the remainder of the school day in a haze, going through the motions of teaching while her mind churned through possibilities. When the final lesson ended and the children had been collected by their parents, she walked slowly back toward Margaret's cottage, needing the older woman's steady presence to help her think clearly. Margaret listened patiently as Evelyn recounted everything Grace had told her, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "You have choices here," Margaret said once Evelyn had finished. "You could continue avoiding this man, hoping he eventually gives up his search. Or you could confront the situation directly, on your own terms, rather than waiting for him to corner you unexpectedly." "I do not know if I am ready to face whatever this means," Evelyn admitted. "If Julian sent him, that means Julian knows I might still be found, that he has not simply let me go." "Would you prefer that he had?" Margaret asked gently. "That he simply moved forward with his life as though you never existed?" Evelyn considered this question carefully. Part of her had assumed, in the quiet corners of her mind, that Julian would eventually forget about her entirely, absorbed once again in his political ambitions and social obligations. The idea that he had instead hired someone to search for her suggested something more complicated, something that unsettled her in ways she had not expected. "I suppose," Evelyn said slowly, "that some part of me wanted to believe he would simply move on. It would have made things simpler." "Life is rarely simple," Margaret replied. "But you are not the same woman who left Callenridge months ago. Whatever this investigator wants, whatever message he carries from your husband, you get to decide how you respond to it. That power belongs entirely to you now." Evelyn spent that evening gathering her resolve, deciding that avoiding the situation any longer would only prolong her anxiety. The following morning, before the schoolhouse bell called the children to their lessons, she walked toward the village inn where Grace had said the stranger was staying. The inn was a modest building near the village entrance run by a cheerful innkeeper named Walter Pembroke, who greeted Evelyn with familiar warmth as she entered. "Miss Marsh, good morning. Here for breakfast, or something else? I understand there is a guest staying here, a Mr. Boswell. I would like to speak with him, if he is available." Walter's expression shifted slightly, clearly recognizing the significance of her request, though he said nothing beyond directing her to a small table near the window, where a well-dressed man sat reviewing papers over a cup of tea. Henry Boswell looked up as Evelyn approached, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he recognized her immediately, despite the description he had likely been carrying for weeks. "Miss Marsh," he said, rising from his seat with practiced politeness. "Or should I address you differently?" Evelyn sat across from him without waiting for an invitation, her hands folded tightly in her lap to steady their trembling. "You may call me Evelyn, since it seems there is little point in continuing the pretense." Henry nodded, setting down his papers. "I have been searching for you for several weeks now, on behalf of the Duke of Callenridge. I want to assure you that my purpose here is not to force you into any particular action. I was simply asked to locate you and report back whether you were safe and willing to receive communication." "And if I am not willing?" Evelyn asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then I report that back as well, and the matter ends there. As far as my involvement is concerned," Henry said honestly, "the Duke has been quite specific that he does not wish to force anything upon you. He simply wishes to know that you are well, and if you are willing, to have the opportunity to speak with you directly." Evelyn studied the investigator's face, searching for any sign of deception, though she found none. He seemed genuinely committed to the boundaries he described, a professional simply doing his job, rather than an agent of coercion. "Why should I believe that Julian has changed his approach at all?" Evelyn asked. "The man I left was not someone who respected boundaries, mine or anyone else's, when it came to getting what he wanted." Henry considered this carefully before responding. "I cannot speak to who the Duke was before I met him. I can only tell you that the man who hired me seemed genuinely troubled, not by scandal or inconvenience, but by something that appeared to be real regret. Whether that regret translates into meaningful change, I could not say. That would be for you to determine, should you choose to see him. Evelyn sat in silence for several long moments, weighing the investigator's words against 3 years of memories that painted a very different picture of the man she had married. Finally, she spoke again. "I am not ready to see him," she said. "Not yet, and perhaps not ever. But I do not want him to continue spending resources searching for me indefinitely. Tell him I am safe, that I have built a life here, and that if he genuinely wishes to make amends, he will respect my need for time and distance before anything further happens." Henry nodded, seeming to understand the delicate balance of her request. "I will relay that message exactly as you have given it. May I ask, will you remain in this village, or do you fear that this information might compromise the safety you have found here?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. She had grown attached to Ashford Hollow, to the children she taught, to Margaret's steady friendship, to the simple rhythms of a life that finally felt like her own. The idea of uprooting everything again, simply out of fear of Julian's reaction, felt like giving him power over her life that she was no longer willing to grant. "I will remain here," she said finally. "If Julian respects the boundaries I have set, there should be no reason for further disruption to my life." Henry seemed satisfied with this response, gathering his papers and preparing to depart the village later that same day. Before he left, however, he offered one final observation that lingered with Evelyn long after their conversation ended. "For what it is worth, Miss Hastings, in my years doing this kind of work, I have seen many wealthy men send investigators after wives or lovers who left them, usually out of wounded pride or a desire to control the narrative of their departure. The Duke's instructions to me were different. He asked me repeatedly to prioritize your safety and comfort above any desire he had to see you again. That does not erase whatever happened between you, but it suggested to me a man genuinely trying to reckon with his own failures." Evelyn thanked him for his honesty, then returned to the schoolhouse with a mind full of conflicting emotions. She taught her lessons that day with considerably more focus than she had managed the previous morning, grateful for the routine that gave her thoughts somewhere productive to settle. That evening she shared the full conversation with Margaret, who listened with the same patient attention she always offered. "You handled that with remarkable clarity," Margaret said once Evelyn finished recounting the exchange. "Many women in your position might have either refused to engage at all or found themselves swept back into old patterns simply from the pressure of being found. I do not know if I made the right choice," Evelyn admitted. "Part of me wonders if I should have refused to speak with the investigator entirely, simply disappeared further into anonymity. But you did not want that," Margaret observed. "Some part of you wanted him to know you are safe, that you have built something meaningful here. That is not weakness, Evelyn. That is simply honesty about your own feelings, even complicated ones." Evelyn considered this as she prepared for bed that night, her mind returning again and again to Henry Boswell's final words about Julian's instructions during the search. She did not know what to make of the possibility that the man who had once treated her as invisible might now be capable of genuine reflection and change. 3 years of disappointment had taught her to be skeptical of such possibilities, yet some small, cautious part of her wondered if there was truth to what the investigator had described. Days passed following the encounter, and life in the village gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Evelyn continued teaching, continued building her friendships with Grace, Alice, and Margaret, continued watching Peter grow more confident with each passing week. But beneath the surface of her daily routine, a new awareness lingered, the knowledge that her location was no longer entirely secret, that Julian now knew, at minimum, that she was safe, and had chosen to remain hidden by choice rather than circumstance. She wondered, in quiet moments, whether he would honor her request for distance, or whether his desperation to see her again would eventually override whatever restraint he had shown through the investigator's careful approach. She had no way of knowing which version of Julian Ashworth would prevail, the calculating Duke who had ignored her for years, or the reportedly humbled man Henry Boswell had described. As autumn deepened across Ashford Hollow, bringing shorter days and colder evenings, Evelyn found herself settling into a strange new equilibrium, one where the past she had left behind no longer felt entirely separate from the life she was building. She continued forward regardless, focusing her energy on her students, her friendships, and the slow process of healing that Margaret often reminded her could not be rushed. Weeks turned into a month without any further contact from Callenridge, and Evelyn allowed herself to relax slightly, believing that perhaps Julian had indeed respected her wishes for space and time. She did not know that Julian had spent those same weeks in quiet turmoil of his own. When Henry Boswell returned to Callenridge with his report, Julian had listened to every detail with an intensity that surprised even the investigator, asking repeated questions about how Evelyn looked, whether she seemed well, whether the village she had chosen appeared to treat her kindly. She specifically asked that you respect her need for distance, Henry told him plainly, watching the Duke's reaction carefully. She is safe, she has built a life for herself, and she does not wish for that life to be disrupted, unless you can demonstrate genuine restraint. Julian sat with this information for a long time after Henry departed, turning the words over in his mind. Every instinct he had cultivated over years of negotiation and command told him to act immediately, to travel to the village himself, to make his case in person before she could build higher walls around her heart. But something in Henry's careful description of her request stopped him. She had not simply run from him in a moment of anger. She had built an entire life, a purpose, relationships that clearly mattered to her, all without his knowledge or involvement. If he arrived now, disrupting that carefully constructed peace out of his own impatience, he would only be proving that he had learned nothing at all. He spent those weeks instead in a kind of deliberate stillness, forcing himself to sit with the discomfort of waiting rather than acting. He continued managing the estate, though with noticeably more attention to the staff who had remained loyal despite his difficult temperament in recent months. He began, for the first time in years, actually listening when Oliver Fenwick offered suggestions rather than dismissing them in favor of his own judgment. One afternoon, while reviewing correspondence in his study, Julian found himself staring at an old portrait of Evelyn that had been painted shortly after their wedding, capturing an expression of quiet hope he had not seen on her face in years before she left. He realized, studying the painting, that he could not recall the last time he had made her smile the way the artist had captured, genuine and unguarded. He called for Oliver later that evening, requesting something unusual for a man of his position. "I want to understand what I did wrong," Julian said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Not simply in broad terms. Specifically, you have watched this household for years. Tell me honestly what you observed." Oliver hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, though he eventually spoke with the same careful honesty Julian had come to respect in him. "You stopped seeing her, Your Grace. Not in the literal sense, but in every meaningful way. Your attention went entirely to matters of business and status, and she became someone you managed rather than someone you shared your life with. I noticed it in small things. You stopped asking about her day. You stopped including her in decisions that once would have been discussed together." Julian absorbed this without argument, recognizing the truth in every word. "Why did no one tell me this sooner?" "It was not our place, Your Grace," Oliver said simply. "And I suspect, even if someone had spoken up, you were not in a position to truly hear it at the time." The observation stung, though Julian could not deny its accuracy. He had been so consumed by ambition, by the constant pressure of maintaining influence among the noble families and merchant houses that mattered to Callenridge's prosperity, that he had genuinely stopped seeing his wife as a person with her own needs and desires separate from her role beside him. In the weeks that followed this conversation, Julian began making small, deliberate changes, not for show, but because he genuinely wanted to understand what kind of man he wished to become. He reduced his social obligations significantly, delegating many of the political discussions he once insisted on handling personally. He spent more time walking the estate grounds alone, thinking, reflecting, trying to understand the pattern of choices that had led him to lose the one person whose presence had once made the entire house feel like more than simply a place of business. He also began, quietly, reading through old letters Evelyn had written him during their courtship, letters full of warmth and genuine excitement about the future they might build together. Reading them now, he felt the full weight of how far they had drifted from that early promise, and how entirely the responsibility for that drift rested with his own choices rather than anything she had done. Meanwhile, in Ashford Hollow, life continued its gentle rhythm, entirely unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within the walls of Callenridge. Evelyn's days remained full with teaching, with the small joys of village life, with evenings spent in Margaret's company discussing everything from village gossip to deeper questions about purpose and healing. One particular evening, as the first frost of the season settled over Ashford Hollow, Evelyn found herself reflecting on how much distance, both physical and emotional, she had managed to place between herself and the woman she had been at Callenridge. The realization brought a mixture of pride and lingering uncertainty, knowing that whatever came next, whether Julian respected her boundaries or eventually pushed against them, she was no longer the same woman who had quietly endured years of neglect without recognizing her own worth. She continued forward regardless, focusing her energy on her students, her friendships, and the slow process of healing that Margaret often reminded her could not be rushed. The investigator's visit had cracked open a door to the past she thought she had firmly closed, but for now, that door remained only slightly ajar, and Evelyn found herself grateful for every day it stayed that way. Snow had begun to fall lightly over Ashford Hollow when Evelyn noticed a stranger standing at the edge of the market square, watching the schoolhouse with an intensity that made her pulse quicken before she even recognized him fully. He wore simple traveling clothes, nothing like the fine, tailored coats she remembered from their life together, and his hair had grown slightly longer, less perfectly groomed than she had ever seen it. But there was no mistaking the way he stood, the particular set of his shoulders, the sharp attention in his gaze even from a distance. Julian had come to the village himself. Evelyn's first instinct was to retreat inside the schoolhouse, though the children had already been dismissed for the day, leaving her with no reasonable excuse to avoid the confrontation she had known might eventually arrive. She stood frozen for a long moment, watching him watch her, neither moving toward the other. Finally gathering the composure she had spent months building, Evelyn walked toward him, stopping several paces away, close enough to speak but far enough to maintain some sense of control over the encounter. "You said you would respect my need for distance," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I have waited 3 months," Julian replied quietly. "I did not come sooner because I wanted to prove I could honor what you asked. But I could not stay away forever, Evelyn. I needed to see you, even if only once, even if you send me away immediately after." Evelyn studied him carefully, searching for the cold detachment she remembered so clearly from their final months together. Instead, she found something unfamiliar in his expression, an openness and vulnerability she had never witnessed from him before. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked directly. "Say what you came to say." He took a breath, clearly having rehearsed this moment many times, though the words still seemed to catch slightly as he spoke them. "I want to tell you that I understand now, more clearly than I ever have, exactly what I did wrong. I stopped seeing you as my partner and started treating you as an obligation, something to be managed alongside everything else demanding my attention. I convinced myself that providing status and security was enough, that you would understand the pressures I faced. I was wrong, and I am deeply sorry for every moment I made you feel invisible." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, unprepared for how genuine his words sounded compared to the calculated charm she remembered from before. Still, 3 years of disappointment had taught her caution, and she was not willing to accept apologies without evidence of real change. "Words are simple, Julian," she said. "You were always skilled with words when it suited your purposes. What proof do I have that anything is actually different now?" He nodded, as though he had expected this response and prepared for it. "I do not expect you to believe me based on words alone. I have made changes at Callenridge these past months, changes I intend to maintain regardless of what happens between us. I have reduced my social obligations, delegated responsibilities I once insisted on controlling personally, and spent considerable time reflecting on the kind of man I want to become, separate from any hope of winning you back." "That is convenient timing," Evelyn observed, unable to keep a hint of skepticism from her voice. "Changes made only after I left, only after you realized what losing me actually cost you." "You are right to question that," Julian admitted. "I cannot argue that these changes came before your departure. If anything, that only proves your point, that it took losing you entirely for me to understand what I should have recognized years ago. I am not asking you to simply forgive that failure. I am asking for the chance to show you, over time, that the changes are genuine rather than temporary." Evelyn crossed her arms, the cold air biting at her cheeks as snow continued falling gently around them. "And if I refuse? If I tell you to return to Callenridge and leave me to the life I have built here?" Julian's expression flickered with something like pain, though he did not argue or plead as she half expected him to. "Then I will respect that decision, difficult as it would be. I came here today prepared for either outcome. I only wanted the chance to say these things directly, rather than through letters or intermediaries." His restraint surprised her more than any grand declaration could have. The Julian she remembered would have argued, would have used charm or pressure to try to sway her decision. This version of him seemed genuinely prepared to accept whatever she decided, without manipulation. "I need time to think," Evelyn finally said. "You cannot simply arrive after months of silence and expect immediate answers." "I understand," Julian said quickly. "I am staying at the inn for a few days, only to be available should you wish to speak further. I will not seek you out again beyond this conversation unless you come to me first." Evelyn nodded slowly, grateful for the boundary he offered without her needing to request it herself. She turned to walk away, then paused, looking back at him one final time. "Why now, Julian? Truly. Not the version you have prepared to say, the actual truth." He considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I found an old letter you wrote me during our courtship, full of hope about the life we might build together. Reading it, I realized how completely I had failed to become the man you believed I could be. I do not know if it is possible to become that man now, after everything. But I know I cannot simply move forward without at least trying. Evelyn left him standing in the snow-covered square, walking back toward Margaret's cottage with her mind racing through everything he had said. She found Margaret waiting by the fire, having apparently seen the stranger's arrival from her window and guessed immediately who he was. "He came," Margaret said simply, not needing confirmation. "He came," Evelyn agreed, sitting heavily in her usual chair. "And he said things I did not expect to hear." She recounted the entire conversation to Margaret, who listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful throughout. "What do you feel, hearing all of that?" Margaret asked once Evelyn finished. "Confused," Evelyn admitted. "Part of me wants to believe he has genuinely changed. Another part remembers exactly how convincing he could be when it served his purposes. I do not know how to tell the difference between real change and simply better performance." "Then do not decide yet," Margaret advised. "You do not owe him an immediate answer simply because he traveled here to deliver one. Take the time you need. Watch his actions, not simply his words, if you choose to engage with him further at all." Evelyn spent that night unable to sleep, replaying every word of their conversation, searching for inconsistencies or manipulation, yet finding none she could clearly identify. The Julian who had spoken to her in the square seemed genuinely humbled in a way she had never witnessed during their marriage, though she remained wary of trusting that impression too quickly. The following morning she made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than avoiding him entirely, or immediately accepting his attempt at reconciliation, she decided to observe him more closely before making any judgment about his sincerity. She sent a brief note to the inn, delivered by one of her older students who occasionally ran errands for small payment, asking Julian to meet her at the village square that afternoon, though this time on her terms rather than his sudden appearance. Julian arrived precisely on time, dressed more simply than she remembered him ever appearing in public during their marriage, waiting patiently near the same spot where they had spoken the previous day. "I am not agreeing to anything yet," Evelyn said as she approached, "but I am willing to allow you the chance to demonstrate what you claim has changed, under conditions I set rather than ones convenient to you. Whatever conditions you require," Julian said without hesitation, "I am prepared to accept them." "You will not stay at the village inn indefinitely, watching my every move," Evelyn continued. "If you wish to prove genuine change, you will find useful work here. Contribute honestly to this community, rather than simply waiting for my forgiveness. And you will not pressure me for answers or affection beyond what I offer freely, in my own time." Julian nodded, absorbing each condition seriously. "I accept all of this. What kind of work would you suggest?" Evelyn considered this, an idea forming as she recalled a conversation with Gareth about needing additional help repairing homes, before the harsher winter months set in. "The carpenter, Gareth Wilmot, needs assistance repairing several homes in the village before winter fully arrives. I do not know if you possess any relevant skills, but the effort itself would speak louder than any words you might offer me." "Then I will learn whatever skills are necessary," Julian said firmly. "I have spent my entire life commanding others to complete tasks I never bothered learning myself. Perhaps it is time I understood honest labor firsthand." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of resentment or reluctance beneath his agreement, finding instead what appeared to be genuine resolve. She did not know yet whether this would prove to be lasting change or simply another performance calculated to win her back, but for the first time since his arrival, she allowed herself a small measure of cautious curiosity about what the coming weeks might reveal. The following morning, Julian presented himself at Gareth's workshop before the sun had fully risen. Dressed in borrowed clothes he had purchased from the village tailor rather than anything from his own wardrobe that might mark him as an outsider. Gareth eyed him with open suspicion, having heard through village gossip exactly who this stranger was, and what history connected him to the schoolteacher everyone had come to love. "Miss Marsh says you need help before winter sets in," Julian said simply, offering no further explanation for his presence. Gareth studied him for a long moment before responding. "I need someone reliable, not someone who will disappear the moment his hands blister or his pride gets wounded." "I will not disappear," Julian said firmly. "Test me however you see fit." Gareth handed him a saw and gestured toward a stack of timber that needed cutting to size for a roof repair on the widow Thornbury's cottage. Julian took the tool with visible uncertainty, having never in his life performed manual labor of any kind, and began working under Gareth's watchful, skeptical eye. The first hour proved humbling in ways Julian had not anticipated. His cuts were uneven, his pace far slower than necessary, and his hands, unused to such labor, quickly began forming the blisters Gareth had predicted. Still, he continued without complaint, adjusting his technique based on Gareth's occasional gruff corrections. By midday, word had spread through the village that the Duke of Callenridge was laboring alongside the local carpenter, and several villagers found excuses to walk past the workshop, curious to witness the spectacle for themselves. Julian remained focused on his task despite the attention, refusing to let embarrassment distract him from proving his sincerity. Evelyn heard about his efforts through Grace later that afternoon, who had witnessed the scene firsthand while delivering bread to nearby homes. He looked utterly out of place, Grace reported, unable to hide her amusement. But he did not complain, not once, even when Gareth made him redo a cut 3 times. Evelyn absorbed this information carefully, uncertain what to make of it. Physical labor alone did not prove genuine transformation, she reminded herself, though she could not deny a small flicker of surprise that Julian had actually followed through on his agreement, rather than finding excuses to avoid the difficult work. Over the following days, Julian continued reporting to Gareth's workshop each morning, gradually improving his skills as the carpenter's patience wore into something resembling grudging respect. He asked questions rather than assuming knowledge, listened to instruction without the defensive pride Evelyn remembered from their years together, and returned each evening to the inn exhausted in a way that seemed to satisfy something in him beyond simple physical tiredness. One evening, as Evelyn walked home from the schoolhouse, she passed the Thornberry cottage and noticed the roof repair nearly completed, sturdy new beams replacing the weathered wood that had threatened collapse before the season's heavier snows arrived. Alice Thornberry stood nearby, thanking Gareth and, somewhat awkwardly, thanking Julian as well for his contribution to the work. "He does not say much," Alice mentioned to Evelyn later that week, during one of their regular conversations at the apothecary shop. "But he works harder than I expected from a man of his station. Gareth says he has stopped needing correction on most tasks now." Evelyn absorbed these reports with cautious interest, neither dismissing them entirely nor allowing herself to become fully convinced by outward effort alone. She continued observing from a careful distance, unwilling to engage directly with Julian beyond occasional brief greetings when their paths crossed in the village square, always maintaining the boundaries she had established during their initial conversation. Smoke curled into the night sky above Ashford Hollow, and the sound of shouting voices tore Evelyn from her sleep before she even understood what was happening. She rushed to her window and saw an orange glow flickering against the darkness, coming from the direction of the schoolhouse. Her heart lurched violently as she pulled on her boots and coat, running out into the freezing night air without pausing to think of anything beyond the building that held her students' books, their small desks, the space where she had rebuilt so much of her purpose over the past months. Villagers were already gathering by the time she arrived, forming a chain to pass buckets of water from the nearby well toward the flames that had caught along one side of the schoolhouse, apparently sparked by a fallen lantern left too close to dry kindling stored for the winter. Gareth directed the effort with practiced calm, while others worked frantically to contain the blaze before it could spread to nearby homes. Evelyn joined the bucket chain immediately, her hands shaking from cold and fear as she passed water toward the flames, praying the building could be saved before the fire consumed everything she had worked to build for the children of the village. Through the chaos, she noticed Julian arriving at a full run, still dressed in the simple work clothes he had adopted over recent weeks, immediately assessing the situation with the kind of decisive clarity she remembered from his more competent moments managing the Callenridge estate. "The well cannot supply enough water fast enough," Julian shouted over the noise, quickly surveying the scene. "We need to redirect the effort toward containing the spread rather than extinguishing it entirely. Clear the brush along the eastern side before the wind carries embers toward the Wilmot cottage." Gareth, despite his lingering skepticism toward the Duke, recognized the soundness of the strategy immediately, and redirected several villagers accordingly. Julian threw himself into the physical labor of clearing brush and dampening the ground around vulnerable structures, working alongside men who had spent months treating him with cautious distance, now united by the shared urgency of the crisis. The fire raged for nearly 2 hours before the combined efforts of the village finally brought it under control, leaving the schoolhouse damaged but not entirely destroyed. Its western wing collapsed and charred while the eastern classrooms remained largely intact. Evelyn stood amid the wreckage as dawn began breaking over the hills, exhaustion and relief mixing together as she surveyed the damage. The books were mostly lost, along with several desks and the small collection of teaching materials she had gathered over her months in the village. But the structure itself, the heart of the building, had survived. Julian approached her cautiously, his face streaked with soot, his hands raw from the night's labor. "The eastern wing should be usable again within a few days, once the debris is cleared. I can help organize repairs to the western section, if you will permit it." Evelyn studied him, noting the genuine exhaustion in his posture, the complete absence of the composed authority he once carried in every situation. Tonight, He had simply worked alongside everyone else, without hesitation or complaint, treating the crisis as something requiring immediate action, rather than delegation to others. "Thank you," she said quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came, "for helping tonight, truly." "I did nothing more than anyone else here," Julian replied, though something in his expression suggested her gratitude meant more to him than he wanted to admit openly. In the days that followed, the entire village rallied around rebuilding the schoolhouse, with Julian working alongside Gareth and several other men from dawn until dusk, determined to have the western wing restored before the harshest weeks of winter arrived. Evelyn found herself watching him more closely during this period, unable to ignore the consistency of his effort, even when no one was specifically observing him, even during moments when exhaustion clearly weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, while sorting through salvageable materials near the schoolhouse, Evelyn overheard a conversation between Julian and Gareth that she was not meant to witness, tucked as she was behind a stack of undamaged shelving. "You have surprised me," Gareth admitted to Julian, his tone lacking its earlier suspicion. "I expected you to grow tired of this within the first week, to remember your title, and abandon the effort once the novelty wore off." "I understand why you expected that," Julian replied honestly. "I would have expected the same from myself months ago, but I have spent too long believing that my position excused me from genuine effort in the parts of life that actually matter. I do not intend to make that mistake again, regardless of whether it changes anything with Evelyn." "You truly believe that, even if she never forgives you?" There was a long pause before Julian answered. "I hope she will, more than I have hoped for anything in years. But if she does not, I still owe it to myself, and to the mistakes I made, to become someone different than the man who let her walk away in the first place." Evelyn remained hidden, her chest tight with emotions she could not fully untangle, hearing words spoken when Julian believed no one connected to her was listening. The sincerity in his voice carried a weight that his earlier declarations in the village square had not quite managed to convey, precisely because this conversation had not been meant for her ears at all. She slipped away quietly before either man noticed her presence, walking back toward Margaret's cottage with her thoughts in disarray. That evening she shared what she had overheard with Margaret, who listened with her usual thoughtful attention. "That is different from words spoken directly to you," Margaret observed. "A man performing sincerity for your benefit is one thing. A man expressing the same conviction when he believes no one who matters to his cause is listening suggests something more genuine." "I do not know what to do with what I heard," Evelyn admitted. "Part of me wants to believe this means he has truly changed. Another part worries that trusting this too quickly will only lead to the same disappointment I experienced before." "Then continue watching," Margaret advised. "You do not need to decide everything at once. Let time and consistent action guide your judgment, rather than a single overheard conversation, however moving it might have been." Evelyn took this advice to heart in the weeks that followed, continuing to observe Julian's efforts without offering him any indication of what she had overheard. The schoolhouse repairs progressed steadily, with Julian's contributions becoming increasingly skilled, as Gareth's initial instruction gave way to genuine collaborative effort between the two men. As winter deepened, bringing heavier snows that tested the village's resources and patience, another challenge arose that would further test whatever transformation Julian claimed to have undergone. Peter, the quiet boy who had lost his mother and found unexpected confidence through Evelyn's teaching, fell seriously ill with a fever that worsened rapidly over the course of a single night. Gareth, frantic with worry for his only child, sent for the village healer, an elderly woman named Constance Hartley, whose knowledge of remedies had served Ashford Hollow for decades. But the fever proved resistant to her usual treatments, and by the second day, Peter's condition had worsened enough that Constance admitted the boy needed medicine beyond what she could provide locally. "There is a physician in the larger town, nearly a day's ride from here," Constance explained to the gathered, worried faces of Gareth, Evelyn, and several concerned neighbors. "He has treatments for this kind of fever that I simply do not possess, but the roads are treacherous with the recent snowfall, and I fear sending anyone alone on such a journey." Julian, who had arrived at the Wilmot cottage upon hearing of Peter's illness, stepped forward immediately. "I will go. I know how to handle difficult roads, and I have resources that might expedite securing the physician's assistance once I arrive." Gareth, despite his lingering complicated feelings toward the Duke, recognized the offer for what it was, a genuine attempt to help in the only way immediately available. "The roads beyond the eastern ridge are the most dangerous. If the snow has drifted as badly as I suspect, you will need to take the longer route through the valley instead." Julian nodded, absorbing the directions carefully, before departing within the hour. Taking one of the village's sturdiest horses and pushing through the worsening weather, with a determination that left everyone who witnessed his departure uncertain, whether to admire his courage or fear for his safety. Evelyn spent the following hours in an agony of worry that surprised her with its intensity, torn between concern for Peter's worsening condition and an unexpected fear for Julian's safety on the treacherous winter roads. She sat with Gareth through the night, helping tend to Peter's fever with cool cloths and quiet reassurance, while privately praying that Julian would return safely with the help they so desperately needed. Julian arrived at the larger town well past midnight, exhausted and half frozen from the journey, immediately seeking out the physician Constance had described. The man, initially reluctant to travel in such weather despite Julian's urgent pleading, finally agreed once Julian offered substantial payment along with his personal word that the situation was genuinely dire. The journey back to Ashford Hollow proved even more treacherous than the journey out, with snow continuing to fall heavily and the temperature dropping further as night wore on. Julian pushed through his own exhaustion, guiding the physician's carriage along the safest paths he could determine, arriving back in the village just as dawn began breaking over the hills. The physician worked quickly upon reaching the Wilmot cottage, administering treatments that finally began breaking Peter's fever within hours. By midday, the boy's condition had stabilized enough that Constance felt confident declaring the immediate danger past, though full recovery would still require careful monitoring over the following days. Gareth, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, found Julian resting exhausted near the cottage's hearth, having refused to leave until certain his efforts had actually helped save the boy. "I do not know how to thank you properly," Gareth said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely displayed openly. "You risked your own safety for my son, a boy who means nothing to you beyond his connection to this village." "He means something to Evelyn," Julian replied simply, and that alone would have been reason enough. "But truthfully, somewhere during these past weeks, this village has come to mean something to me as well, beyond simply my hope of winning her back." Evelyn, standing nearby and overhearing this exchange, felt something shift within her chest, a wall she had carefully maintained since Julian's arrival beginning to show its first genuine cracks. She did not fully trust the feeling yet, remained cautious about moving too quickly toward forgiveness she was not certain she was ready to offer, but watching Julian's exhausted, genuine relief at Peter's recovery, she found herself no longer able to dismiss the possibility that the transformation she had witnessed over recent weeks might be entirely real. That evening, once Peter had fallen into a peaceful, healing sleep and Gareth had finally been convinced to rest as well, Evelyn found Julian sitting alone outside the cottage, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, staring up at the clearing night sky as the snow finally began to ease. "You should be resting," she said, approaching cautiously. "You have hardly slept in 2 days." "I could not sleep even if I tried," Julian admitted. "My mind keeps returning to how close we came to losing him, and to how strange it feels that I care so much about a boy I barely knew existed a few months ago." Evelyn sat beside him, keeping a careful distance, though closer than she had allowed herself since his arrival in the village. "Peter has that effect on people. He reminds you what genuine resilience looks like, especially after everything he has already survived." "Much like his teacher," Julian said quietly, glancing at her briefly before returning his gaze to the sky. Evelyn did not respond immediately, unsure how to navigate the unexpected tenderness in his observation. "I heard what you said to Gareth," she admitted finally, "about this village meaning something to you now, beyond simply hoping to win me back." Julian's expression shifted, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. "I meant every word. I did not expect this place to change me the way it has. I came here believing that proving myself to you was the only goal that mattered. Somewhere along the way, I began to understand what an honest life could actually feel like, separate from status or ambition. I do not know how to fully explain it, except that I no longer recognize the man who once dismissed you at that dinner party months ago. Change takes more than a few months of hard labor and one dangerous journey through the snow," Evelyn said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "I know," Julian agreed. "I am not asking you to believe the change is complete or perfect. I am only asking you to consider that it might be real, even if it remains unfinished." Evelyn considered his words carefully, watching the last of the snowfall settle over the quiet village around them. "I am still afraid," she admitted, the honesty surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Afraid that if I let myself trust this, I will find myself disappointed again, in ways that might hurt even more than before, precisely because I allowed myself to hope. I cannot promise you will never be disappointed by me again," Julian said honestly. "I am not perfect, and I likely never will be. But I can promise that I will keep trying, keep choosing to see you, to value you, in every way I failed to before. That promise means little without time to prove it, I understand that. But it is the only honest thing I have to offer you right now. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the cold air sharp around them, though neither seemed eager to end the moment despite the late hour. Finally, Evelyn rose, offering him a small, uncertain smile before returning toward Margaret's cottage. "Rest, Julian," she said softly. "Whatever comes next, you have earned at least that much tonight." In the days that followed Peter's recovery, the village's regard for Julian shifted noticeably, the earlier suspicion giving way to genuine acceptance among many who had witnessed his tireless efforts during the crisis. Even Gareth, who had been perhaps the most skeptical of the Duke's intentions, began treating Julian with something approaching real friendship, inviting him to share meals with his family, as Peter continued his recovery. Evelyn noticed these changes with quiet interest, allowing herself, cautiously, to imagine a future where the walls she had built around her heart might eventually come down entirely. She did not rush this process, remained mindful of Margaret's advice to let time and consistent action guide her judgment, rather than any single dramatic gesture, however moving. The schoolhouse repairs finished just before the heaviest snows of winter settled fully over Ashford Hollow, the children returning to lessons in a building that felt, if anything, stronger for having survived the fire that threatened to destroy it. Peter returned to class as well, fully recovered, his presence a living reminder of everything the village had endured together during those difficult weeks. As winter wore on, Julian remained in the village, continuing his work alongside Gareth, attending village gatherings with the same simple humility he had shown since his arrival, never pushing Evelyn for more than she was willing to offer, content instead to let his consistent presence speak for itself. Evelyn found herself, slowly and cautiously, beginning to imagine a future she had not allowed herself to consider since the night she first left Callenridge behind. A sharp knock at Margaret's door pulled Evelyn from her thoughts on a cold February morning, and she opened it to find Oliver Fenwick standing there, snow dusting his coat, an expression of urgency on his usually composed face. "Miss Hastings," he said, using her true name for the first time since her departure. "Forgive the intrusion, but I bring news that could not wait. Several of the merchant families who supported the Duke's political standing have begun spreading rumors intended to damage Callenridge's reputation, using his prolonged absence and neglect of his duties as evidence that he is unfit to maintain his position of influence." Evelyn felt a flicker of alarm, though she was uncertain why the news affected her so strongly, given the distance she had maintained from Callenridge's political affairs for months. "Why come to me with this? I have no involvement in the Duke's political standing anymore." "Because the rumors specifically target his character regarding his marriage," Oliver explained. "Certain families are suggesting that his absence proves instability, using the story of your departure and his subsequent search for you as evidence that he cannot be trusted with the responsibilities of his title. Lord Pemberton, in particular, seems eager to use this scandal to advance his own family's political position at Callenridge's expense." Evelyn absorbed this information carefully, recognizing immediately the kind of calculated political maneuvering that had once consumed so much of Julian's attention during their marriage. "What does Julian intend to do about this?" "That is precisely the difficulty," Oliver said. "He refuses to leave the village or interrupt his efforts here to address the situation directly, despite my counsel that his continued absence only strengthens Lord Pemberton's claims. He insists that returning to Callenridge purely for political damage control would betray everything he has tried to become these past months." Evelyn found Julian later that day at Gareth's workshop, still dressed in his work clothes despite the news Oliver had delivered, focused entirely on completing a set of furniture repairs for one of the village families. "Oliver told you," Julian said without looking up from his work, clearly having anticipated her visit. "He did. Why are you not addressing this directly? Your position, your family's influence, everything you have built could be at risk." Julian finally set down his tools, meeting her gaze directly. "Because if I rush back to Callenridge now, purely to defend my political standing, I prove that nothing has actually changed within me, that my priorities remain exactly where they were before, focused on status and reputation, rather than the things that genuinely matter." "But your title, your family's legacy, surely that matters as well," Evelyn pressed, surprised by her own instinct to defend interests that were no longer technically hers to protect. "It matters," Julian agreed, "but not more than continuing to become the man I want to be, regardless of whether Lord Pemberton succeeds in his political games. If losing standing among certain noble families is the cost of genuine change, then I am prepared to accept that cost." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, recognizing in his calm resolve something entirely different from the anxious, status-driven man she remembered from their marriage. "That is either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish." "Perhaps both," Julian said, allowing a small, genuine smile to cross his face for the first time since their reunion months earlier. But I would rather be foolish in this way than wise in the way I used to be. Despite his stated intentions to remain uninvolved, circumstances soon forced Julian's hand regardless of his personal wishes. Word arrived a week later that Lord Pemberton intended to formally petition for increased influence over certain trade agreements previously overseen by Callenridge, using the extended scandal surrounding Julian's absence as justification for the request. Oliver returned to the village once more, this time with a proposal that required Julian's direct involvement regardless of his reluctance to prioritize political matters over his continued efforts in Ashford Hollow. "You do not need to return to Callenridge permanently," Oliver explained. "But a brief, decisive response addressing these rumors directly, perhaps even acknowledging the truth of your reconciliation efforts rather than hiding from the scandal, might actually strengthen your position rather than weaken it further." Julian considered this carefully, then turned to Evelyn, who had accompanied him to hear Oliver's proposal. "I will not do this without your agreement. If you are unwilling to have your name associated publicly with this situation in any way, I will find another approach, even if it costs me the political ground Pemberton seeks to claim." Evelyn appreciated the genuine consideration behind his hesitation, recognizing how different this moment felt from the countless times during their marriage when Julian had made decisions affecting her without any thought of consultation. "What exactly would this response require?" she asked. "A brief public acknowledgement," Oliver explained, "that the Duke's absence stemmed from genuine efforts to repair his marriage, rather than any instability or neglect of his responsibilities. It would not require your direct participation, only your permission for Julian to speak honestly about the situation, rather than allowing Pemberton's version of events to stand unchallenged." Evelyn considered this request carefully, weighing her desire to protect the privacy she had built in Ashford Hollow against her growing recognition that Julian's genuine transformation deserved acknowledgement, rather than allowing political opportunists to distort the truth for their own advantage. "You may speak honestly about the situation," she finally said, "on the condition that you make clear nothing has been decided between us yet, that whatever happens next remains entirely uncertain and dependent on my own choice, not simply your public declaration of changed character." Julian agreed immediately to these terms, traveling briefly to Callenridge to address the rumors directly among the gathered noble families, acknowledging honestly that his absence had indeed stemmed from personal failures within his marriage, failures he had spent recent months genuinely working to understand and correct. He made no attempt to minimize his past mistakes or exaggerate the current state of his relationship with Evelyn, presenting instead a measured, honest account that surprised many who had expected either denial or dramatic declaration. Lord Pemberton's attempt to use the scandal for political advantage lost much of its force in the face of Julian's straightforward honesty, and within weeks, the immediate political threat to Callenridge's standing had largely dissipated, though Julian made clear upon returning to the village that he had no intention of resuming the intense political ambitions that had once consumed nearly all of his attention. "I want a different kind of life," he told Evelyn upon his return, sitting once again in the familiar space outside Gareth's workshop where so many of their honest conversations had taken place over recent months. "Even if you decide not to be part of it, I no longer wish to return fully to the man I was before, chasing influence and status at the expense of everything that actually gives life meaning." Evelyn listened to this declaration with a growing sense that the man before her truly had transformed in ways she could no longer reasonably doubt. The consistency of his actions over many months, through crisis and quiet daily labor alike, through his handling of the political scandal with honesty rather than manipulation, all pointed toward genuine change rather than temporary performance. "I need to tell you something," Evelyn said finally, taking a breath before continuing. "I have watched you these past months, testing whether your change was real or simply another version of the charm you once used so effectively. I no longer believe it is performance, Julian. I believe you have genuinely become someone different, someone I might actually trust with my heart again." Julian's expression shifted with cautious hope, though he remained still, clearly unwilling to push the moment faster than she was ready to allow. "But I will not simply return to the life we had before," Evelyn continued. "If there is to be any future between us, it must look entirely different from our marriage at Callenridge. I will not disappear into a role that erases who I have become here, the teacher, the woman with her own purpose and voice. Whatever we build together must honor both of those things equally." "I would not want it any other way," Julian said immediately. "I do not wish to reclaim the wife who managed my household and smiled politely at gatherings while I ignored her. I want to know the woman who rebuilt an entire life from nothing, who teaches children with such patience and skill, who commands genuine respect in this village through her own character rather than any title. If you are willing to give us another chance, I want all of that, not simply a return to what we lost." Evelyn felt tears gathering, though they carried none of the grief that had marked her departure from Callenridge months earlier. Instead, they felt like release, like the culmination of a long, difficult journey toward understanding what she truly wanted from her life and the people in it. "Then let us build something new," she said softly. "Not a return to what we were, but something we choose together, deliberately, with both of us fully present this time." Julian reached for her hand, hesitant at first, relieved when she did not pull away. "I love you, Evelyn. Not simply the memory of who you were before, but the woman standing before me now, entirely her own person, exactly as you should be." "I love you too," Evelyn admitted, the words feeling both frightening and genuinely freeing after so many months of careful guarding. "Though I am still learning what that love looks like now, separate from everything that came before." They remained together outside the workshop as evening settled over Ashford Hollow, discussing quietly what a shared future might actually look like, one that honored the life Evelyn had built in the village while allowing Julian to continue the genuine transformation he had undergone. They spoke of maintaining her teaching position, of Julian dividing his time between necessary duties at Callenridge and a home they might build together in or near the village she had come to love, of raising any future children with the same values of honesty and presence that had come to define their renewed connection. Months later, as spring arrived and the first blossoms appeared across the hills surrounding Ashford Hollow, Julian proposed to Evelyn not with grand ceremony or public spectacle, but in a quiet moment at the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, presenting her with a simple ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman known throughout Callenridge's history for her fierce independence and genuine kindness. "I am asking you to marry me again," Julian said, kneeling before her in the empty classroom, not as the Duke reclaiming his Duchess, but as a man who has learned, through genuine effort and painful reflection, what it truly means to see and value the woman he loves. Evelyn accepted, not with the uncertain hope of a woman desperate for validation, but with the clear-eyed confidence of someone who had rebuilt her entire sense of self and now chose, deliberately and freely, to share that renewed life with a partner who had proven himself worthy of the second chance she offered. Their second wedding, held in the village square of Ashford Hollow rather than the grand halls of Callenridge, brought together the two worlds that had once seemed entirely separate. Villagers and noble family alike, celebrating a union built not on status or convenience, but on genuine transformation and hard-earned trust. Peter served as a young attendant, beaming with pride at being included in the celebration, while Margaret, Grace, and Gareth stood among the honored guests who had witnessed every stage of the journey that led to this moment. As Evelyn looked around at the community that had helped her rebuild her life, and at the man beside her who had proven, through months of consistent action rather than empty words, that genuine change was indeed possible, she understood that walking away from Callenridge had not been an ending after all, but the necessary beginning of a love finally built on equal footing, honest partnership, and the kind of respect that neither status nor title could ever guarantee on their own. The morning of the wedding began with a gentle rain that cleared by midday, leaving the village square fresh and fragrant with the scent of early spring blossoms. Grace had insisted on helping Evelyn prepare, arranging simple flowers through her hair rather than the elaborate jeweled combs that had marked her first wedding at Callenridge years before. "You look happier than I have ever seen you," Grace said, studying Evelyn's reflection in the small mirror Margaret kept in her cottage. "Not just pretty, though you are certainly that. Happy, in a way that reaches your eyes." "I feel different this time," Evelyn admitted, smoothing the simple, elegant dress she had chosen, instead of anything resembling the grand formal gowns of her previous life. "Before, I was marrying a title, a position, a life I thought I was supposed to want. This time I am simply marrying Julian, the man he has become, on terms that honor who I am as well." Margaret arrived shortly after, carrying a small bundle of herbs tied with ribbon, a village tradition meant to bring good fortune to new marriages. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become," she said softly, pressing the bundle into Evelyn's hands, "not simply for finding love again, but for insisting it come to you on your own terms." Evelyn embraced the older woman warmly, grateful beyond words for the friendship that had anchored her through the most difficult and transformative months of her life. Without Margaret's steady wisdom, she doubted she would have found the clarity necessary to navigate Julian's return with the careful balance of openness and caution it had required. Meanwhile, Julian prepared for the ceremony with far less fanfare than his first wedding had demanded. dressing simply in the village square rather than the elaborate chapel at Callenridge where noble families had gathered years before to witness a very different kind of union, one built more on expectation than genuine affection. Oliver Fenwick, who had traveled from Callenridge to witness the ceremony, found Julian adjusting his coat with unusual nervousness for a man normally so composed in public settings. "You seem more anxious than I expected, Your Grace," Oliver observed, a rare note of gentle humor in his voice. "This matters more than anything I have ever done," Julian admitted. Before, marrying Evelyn felt like fulfilling an expectation, securing a suitable match that would serve the family's standing. Today, I am marrying the woman I genuinely love, who has every reason to have refused me, and chose instead to give me this chance. That is far more terrifying than any political negotiation I have ever undertaken. Oliver nodded, understanding the weight behind his employer's words. "For what it is worth, Your Grace, I have served this family for many years, and I have never seen you as settled, as genuinely present, as you have been these past months in this village. Whatever doubts you carry today, know that the transformation itself has been entirely real." The ceremony itself proved simple by noble standards, conducted by the village's own minister rather than any grand religious figure typically associated with Callenridge's formal occasions. Villagers filled the square alongside the small number of noble guests Julian had invited, creating an unusual but genuinely warm gathering that reflected the blended life the couple intended to build together. Peter, dressed in his best clothes and clearly proud of his role as a young attendant, carried the rings forward with careful concentration, earning gentle laughter from the gathered crowd when he nearly tripped over the hem of his own borrowed jacket before catching himself with practiced dignity. When Julian spoke his vows, he departed from the traditional formal language typically expected of noble ceremonies, instead speaking directly and honestly about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I promise to see you, truly see you, every single day, not simply as my wife but as the remarkable woman you have always been, even during the years I failed to recognize it," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet square. "I promise to value your voice, your work, your independence, as equally important to our shared life as anything I might contribute. I promise never again to let ambition or status blind me to what actually matters." Evelyn, in turn, offered her own honest vow, one that acknowledged both the pain of their past and the genuine hope she now carried for their future. "I promise to bring the woman I have become into this marriage, not simply the wife I once was. I promise to continue growing, teaching, building purpose beyond our shared life together, trusting that you will support rather than diminish that growth. And I promise to offer you the grace of continued trust, built through your consistent actions rather than empty words alone." As the ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd erupted into genuine celebration, Evelyn found herself surrounded by the community that had witnessed and supported every stage of her transformation, from the frightened woman who had arrived in Ashford Hollow with barely any belongings, to the confident teacher and now bride who stood before them, having built a life entirely her own before choosing, freely and deliberately, to share that life with the man who had proven himself worthy of her trust once again. The celebration continued long into the evening, with music and dancing filling the village square in a manner far removed from the carefully orchestrated formal gatherings that had once defined Evelyn's social life at Callenridge. She danced with Julian under strings of simple lanterns, laughing freely in a way she had nearly forgotten was possible, surrounded by friends who had become as essential to her happiness as the love she had rediscovered with her husband. Later that night, as the celebration finally wound down and the village settled into peaceful quiet, Evelyn and Julian walked together, along the familiar road leading toward the small home they had chosen to build near the edge of Ashford Hollow, close enough to the village she loved, yet offering the privacy their new life together deserved. "Are you happy?" Julian asked quietly, his hand intertwined with hers as they walked beneath a sky full of stars. "More than I ever imagined possible," Evelyn answered honestly. "Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is real. We built this together, on truth rather than expectation. And that makes it worth more than anything I once believed marriage was supposed to offer." Julian brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of genuine tenderness rather than practiced charm. "Then let us continue building, together, for as long as we both shall live, honoring every lesson this difficult journey has taught us." And as they continued walking toward the home that awaited them, Evelyn understood fully that her decision to walk away from Callenridge months earlier had not been an act of destruction, but the necessary foundation for a love finally built to last. One rooted in genuine partnership rather than the hollow expectations that had nearly cost them everything. A year had passed since the wedding in the village square, and Ashford Hollow had grown accustomed to the sight of the Duke of Callenridge walking its lanes each morning. no longer a curiosity or a subject of gossip, but simply another familiar presence woven into the fabric of daily village life. The home Julian and Evelyn had built together stood at the edge of the village, modest by the standards of Callenridge, but filled with a warmth neither had known during their first years of marriage. Evelyn continued teaching at the rebuilt schoolhouse, her classroom now larger to accommodate the growing number of children whose parents had heard of her reputation for patience and genuine care. Julian divided his time between necessary duties at Callenridge, which he now handled with far less obsessive focus than before, and the quiet work he had come to genuinely value in the village, whether assisting Gareth with carpentry projects or helping organize the harvest festivals that had become a favorite tradition for the entire community. One crisp autumn morning, Evelyn woke feeling unusually tired, a sensation that Margaret, upon hearing her describe it over their now customary morning tea, recognized immediately with a knowing smile. "I believe congratulations may be in order," Margaret said gently, watching Evelyn's expression shift from confusion to dawning realization. When Constance Hartley confirmed the pregnancy several days later, Evelyn found herself overwhelmed with a mixture of joy and cautious hope she had not expected. She and Julian had spoken of children during their engagement, though neither had rushed toward the topic, both wanting to ensure their renewed partnership stood on solid ground before adding the complexity of a family. Telling Julian proved to be one of the most tender moments of their marriage. He had returned from Callenridge that evening. Tired from a day spent reviewing trade agreements he now delegated far more readily than in his previous life, and found Evelyn waiting for him in their small kitchen, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her apron. "I have news," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and vulnerability. "We are going to have a child." Julian stood frozen for a moment, processing the words, before crossing the room and pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have. "Evelyn, this is more than I ever dared hope for. Are you well? Is there anything you need?" "I am well," she assured him, laughing softly at his immediate concern. "Constance says everything appears healthy and normal. We have months yet before anything changes drastically." That evening, they sat together by their modest hearth, discussing the future with the same honest openness that had come to define their relationship since Julian's return to the village. They spoke of raising their child with values entirely different from those that had shaped Julian's own childhood, one marked by rigid expectation and emotional distance in favor of political advancement. "I want our children to know they are valued for who they are," Julian said, "not for what advantageous marriages they might secure or what political connections they might strengthen. I want them to understand that love, real love, requires presence and honesty, not simply status and obligation." Evelyn agreed wholeheartedly, though she also expressed her own hopes for their future family. "I want our children to grow up understanding that a title does not define worth, that hard work and genuine kindness matter more than any noble bloodline. I want them to know children like Peter, to understand that friendship crosses every boundary of class and circumstance." As Evelyn's pregnancy progressed through the following months, the village embraced the news with genuine warmth, Grace and Alice organizing small gatherings to help prepare for the child's arrival, while Gareth, now counting Julian among his closest friends, began crafting a small wooden cradle as a gift for the growing family. Peter, now nearly a year older and thriving both academically and socially since his recovery from the illness that had once threatened his life, took particular interest in the impending arrival, often visiting Evelyn after school to ask questions about what having a younger sibling in the village might mean, given his own status as an only child. "Will you still teach once the baby comes?" he asked one afternoon, genuine concern evident in his young voice. "I intend to continue teaching, yes," Evelyn assured him, "though I may need some time away when the baby first arrives, but this schoolhouse, and all of you, mean too much to me to simply walk away from it." Peter seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to his lessons with renewed focus, though he made a point afterward of telling his father that he intended to help teach the younger children himself, should Evelyn need additional assistance during her time away. Winter arrived once more over Ashford Hollow, bringing with it memories of the difficult months that had marked Julian's initial return to the village, the fire that had nearly destroyed the schoolhouse, Peter's dangerous illness, and the political scandal that had briefly threatened Callenridge's standing. But this winter felt entirely different, marked instead by anticipation and quiet domestic happiness rather than crisis and uncertainty. Evelyn gave birth to a healthy daughter on a cold morning in early winter, with Margaret and Constance both present to assist, while Julian waited anxiously in the small sitting room of their home, pacing in a manner that reminded Margaret, when she later described the scene to Evelyn, of every anxious new father she had witnessed over her many years in the village. They named the child Rosalind, After Julian's grandmother, whose ring Evelyn now wore, a woman remembered throughout Callenridge's history for combining fierce independence with genuine warmth, qualities Julian hoped his daughter might inherit from both her namesake and her remarkable mother. Holding their daughter for the first time, Julian felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, entirely different from anything he had experienced during his years focused on political ambition and social status. This tiny, entirely dependent life represented everything he now understood truly mattered: connection, presence, the willingness to prioritize genuine relationship over any external measure of success or influence. "She has your eyes," Julian said softly, studying his daughter's face as Evelyn rested after the difficult labor. "And your stubbornness, I suspect, given how reluctant she was to arrive," Evelyn replied with tired laughter, though her expression carried nothing but pure contentment. As word spread through the village of Rosalind's safe arrival, well-wishers began arriving at their home with small gifts and warm congratulations, the entire community treating the birth as a shared celebration rather than simply a private family matter. Peter arrived with his father, presenting a small wooden toy Gareth had carved specifically for the occasion, while Grace brought enough bread and pastries to feed the entire household for several days. Watching this outpouring of genuine community support, Evelyn found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that difficult night she had left Callenridge behind. She had walked away from a marriage built on obligation and neglect, uncertain of what awaited her beyond the immediate need to reclaim her own sense of self and worth. She could never have imagined, during those early uncertain days in the village, that she would eventually find herself here, surrounded by genuine friendship, raising a daughter with a husband who had proven himself capable of real transformation, building a life that honored both her independence and their shared partnership equally. Julian, too, reflected often during those early weeks of Rosalind's life on how far his own journey had carried him from the man who had once dismissed his wife in favor of political advantage. He continued his reduced involvement in the more calculating aspects of noble politics, delegating increasing responsibility to Oliver and other trusted advisors, choosing instead to prioritize the genuine relationships that had come to define his happiness: his marriage to Evelyn, his friendship with Gareth and the wider village community, and now, most precious of all, his role as father to their daughter. Years later, as Rosalind grew alongside other village children, attending her mother's schoolhouse and forming her own friendships within the community that had witnessed her parents' remarkable journey toward genuine partnership, Evelyn and Julian would often reflect on how their story had unfolded so differently from what either might have expected during those painful early years of their first marriage. They had learned, through genuine hardship and patient transformation, that love built purely on status or obligation could never sustain genuine happiness, that real partnership required consistent presence, honest communication, and the willingness to prioritize each other's growth and well-being above any external measure of success. On quiet evenings, once Rosalind had grown old enough to ask about the story of her parents' marriage, Evelyn would tell her, gently and honestly, about the mother who had once felt invisible in her own home, about the difficult choice to leave everything familiar behind in search of a life that felt genuinely her own. She never hid the painful parts of the story, believing her daughter deserved the full truth rather than a simplified fairy tale version of events. "Did you hate him when you left?" Rosalind asked once, her young mind trying to reconcile the loving father she knew with the distant man her mother described from those early years. "I did not hate him," Evelyn answered carefully. "I was hurt, and I needed to leave to understand my own worth again. But hating him was never the point. Choosing myself was." Julian, for his part, made a point throughout Rosalind's childhood of telling her honestly about his own failures during those early years, believing that shielding her from the truth of his mistakes would only rob her of an important lesson about accountability and genuine growth. "I was not always the father or husband I should have been," he told her once, when she was old enough to understand such complexities. "I let ambition blind me to what truly mattered. Your mother taught me, through her courage in leaving, that real love requires more than simply providing security. It requires presence, attention, and genuine respect." Rosalind grew up understanding, in ways many children of noble families never fully grasped, that titles and wealth meant little without genuine character to support them. She formed friendships freely across the boundaries of class that had once seemed so rigid within Callenridge's traditional society, counting Peter, now approaching his teenage years, among her closest companions despite the difference in their family circumstances. The village of Ashford Hollow itself flourished during these years, benefiting from Julian's continued investment in its well-being, improved roads, a larger schoolhouse to accommodate the growing number of families drawn to the community's reputation for genuine warmth and opportunity, and a small clinic established with Constance Hartley's guidance to ensure better medical care for future crises, learning from the frightening uncertainty that had once nearly cost Peter his life. Evelyn continued teaching for many years afterward, watching generations of village children grow under her patient guidance, always reminding herself, during difficult days, of the long journey that had brought her from a woman who felt invisible in her own marriage to someone who had rebuilt her entire sense of purpose and worth through her own determined effort. Their love, tested by separation and rebuilt through patient, consistent action, stood as proof that genuine change remained possible, even for those who had once seemed most resistant to it, and that second chances, when built on truth rather than convenience, could indeed create something more lasting and meaningful than what had been lost.